Greetings, Writing Art Criticism students. I hope this finds you well. Welcome to week number 5, Thanksgiving week, and I would like to take the opportunity to wish each and every one of you a happy Thanksgiving. I hope it's a time for rest and relaxation, reconnecting with family and friends and being around those whom you care about and those who care about you. I want to apologize again for being off the radar over these last few weeks. You deserve more than that, better than that. As I'm going through your discussion prompts, I'll be responding and beginning to respond to each and every one of you. So I beg your patience and forgiveness, and I'll make it up to you. This week, I don't want you to have to turn in a discussion prompt. And in fact, there's some readings in Kerr Houston's textbook that I'd like you to look at. But other than that, you can finish up some of the readings that I provided last week. You have a paper proposal that is supposed to be due November 30th, I think. Let's make it Monday, December 3rd, and give you a few extra days. And it's only 250 to 500 words. It's giving me an idea of what you want to work on for your final paper, how you want to work on it, and why you're interested in doing it. And it just gives me enough, it gets you to be thinking about it, making a decision, so you're not working at the last minute. It allows me to be able to give you some guidance, some ideas, potential research directions and resources. So it's really in your best interest to get it in as soon as you can. So, but I'll give you through December 3rd. A few things in going through, looking back over last week's readings and responding to your prompts. I want to draw your attention to a couple things. One is, and I didn't mention it during the last video chat, was just how remarkable Oscar Wilde's text is, the critic as artist. The idea that the critic now is engaged in a creative act is so important and such a part of the modern tradition. If we look at Diderot and see Diderot's writing for the salon, for the royal and aristocratic classes throughout Europe in the late 18th century, and we see him on the cusp of the modern tradition, working within the Enlightenment, in the modern age, but working firmly within the academic structure with traditional notions, classical notions of the role of art. Diderot is not playing the role of the artist. He is playing the role of the judge, and he's critiquing in such a way that he can see he's judging the deficiencies of the artist's composition, application of color, line, etc. And in that traditional manner in which there is a particular ideal that the artist is working towards, the critic can see that ideal too. And in fact, the critic is perhaps even more equipped to be able to articulate that idea. And so in many ways, Diderot is giving us a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And yet he's also using his criticism to write these really quite fanciful stories about these painters and their paintings. An act of creation in many ways, in every way, in fact. But he knows his audience, he knows what he wants to emphasize, and he wants to emphasize morality, he wants to emphasize ethics, he wants to emphasize clarity in thinking. Art is representative of, embodies the stability of culture, of society, which gives it an inherently political dimension. If you have stable throne, secular government, and stable altar, the church, then clearly the visual arts then will represent that stability. And if there's instability, the arts will represent that as well. And so art is the expression of these values in place. And Diderot is trying to articulate those values. But Wilde is representing something that is distinctive to modern art criticism and work in the 19th century, and that is that the critic is playing a role in which art becomes the subject, becomes nature for the critic. Like the painter goes out into the landscape, as the Impressionist does, and looks at a haystack and paints that haystack. Wilde sees the work of art as a haystack, that the critic, as a painter, goes out and paints. His argument that it is much harder to be a critic is an interesting one. Very interesting insight in terms of what the artist does. For Wilde suggests that what the artist does is simply create and create and create and create, and there's only one way to create, his way or her way. The critic has to see all of these other artists that are doing it their way, for which there is no other way, creating, 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 and the critic needs to figure out a way to be able to assimilate that, to judge that, to find ways to understand relationships. And so that critic's creative task is a challenge in which the critic can't hold that kind of, this is the only way to make art, because it's the only way to make art for me. The critic can't hold that position. The critic has to relativize it and then find a way to create some sorts of unities in relationships. An important part of Romanticism that's a deeply important influence in modern art and culture and modern art criticism is that beauty, instead of having a timeless essence, is relative to the historical period. So each age has its own embodiment of beauty. And the role of the artist and the critic is to articulate that. What is that? What is beautiful in the 1880s in Paris? What is that? And the question of what the avant-garde does in terms of the engine that is driving modern art and criticism is the belief that the arts aren't just an expression of culture, an expression of a healthy or a degenerate society, but that art is actually transformative of it. It changes it. It's not just an expression of it. It's not decorating or illustrating worldview. It's shaping it. It's a source of critique. It's a way of provoking change and revolution and transformation. And what artists and critics and intellectuals working beginning in the 19th century in Paris are thinking about is this. If the arts are, say, if painting is an expression of political, religious, social values, the stability, the health, or the degeneracy. If it's the traditional view then is that art is just the expression of that. But what happens if you think that the arts, if you change the art, will it move the other way? Will the influence go the other way? Is not just art an expression of church and state, political, social values, but what would happen if the art begins to shift and change? If it's changing, will it have an effect on church and state? That is what the modern artist and the art critic is thinking about. Change the art, and it may change political, social, cultural, economic structures. That's the avant-garde ideal. That's the utopian vision of the avant-garde. That it's the arts is the place where imaginations are ignited, where change can take place. Rather than just be a place, the salon or the museum, a place you go on a Sunday afternoon to blow off steam or to relax. It's a place where you engage deeper into the public and social responsibilities. Becomes a means of social agitation. It becomes a means of, of, of personal and collective change. Also, we didn't get to talk about. I didn't talk to you about Walter Benjamin's really complex essay, "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction," in which the essay hits upon the idea of the photograph, of a photographic reproduction of works of art, and how that shifts the relationship. I mean, no doubt the expectation that we have when we go to the Louvre and go to that room where Leonardo's Mona Lisa is shaped by mechanical reproduction. But also this relationship that Benjamin draws between aura and or aura and exhibition value. Is you have the work of art itself that is there, and the relationship that we have with it, and how aura creates a distance, a kind of almost in many ways kind of fetish, a religious component that we will give to relics. And I think Benjamin's essay is worth rereading and thinking about in relationship to this. What happens to the work of art when it's exhibited? What happens when it's reproduced mechanically? And what is this thing, this aura that is generated? And does it come out of the work, or is it imposed on the work? A couple of you guys mentioned Diderot actually reflecting on the character of certain artists. That somehow their character is represented, embodied in their work, and that's a really interesting notion. It's something that has its roots in the tradition of icon painting, in which the iconographers, before they would paint, say an icon of Christ or the Theotokos and the Christ Child, Mary and the Christ Child, would engage in a period of fasting and devotion and prayer in order to purify themselves, that their character is embodied in that work, and so they must come to their panel to paint the icon in a spiritual state of mind, in a state of mind that is spiritually clean. And then in the modern tradition, you have artists picking up on that. The novelist and critic Emile Zola wrote about Pissarro. When he saw one of Pissarro's paintings, he says, "That is a painting by a moral man." Or Picasso said, "It doesn't really matter what really is of interest to us about Cézanne isn't the work, it's the person." So this idea that the person is important, and it's influenced by the romantic notion of temperament. Zola writes about it in the early 19th century. Balzac writes about it, and other writers in the 18th and 19th century writing about it. That art is about an artist's personal temperament, and that is what is being communicated. It is looking at the world through a temperament. It's not just looking at a landscape or a bouquet of flowers. It's looking at it through the sensibilities of a particular temperament. And also, what I think art criticism explicitly, implicitly, consciously, unconsciously has to deal with is the question of why. Why make art? Why claim for it an importance when there is so much injustice, suffering, fear, evil in the world? And in many ways, art criticism in the modern tradition is the justification of it. The German theorist Adorno, Theodor Adorno, wrote, "How can one make art after Auschwitz?" I think that's a powerful question. How can you make art? How can you celebrate life? How can you focus on beauty? How can you make art when certain people were walked off to a gas chamber, when you had such an incredible systematic inhumanity? In the modern world, what we are capable of as human beings. And does art justify that suffering? Does the art justify the suffering that an artist imposes upon his or her family? The novelist Hemingway, his son was asked about this, and Hemingway's son died of AIDS in Miami, at a Miami hospice. Struggled with his sexual identity and gender, drug addiction. Asked him about his father's work, and he said, my father wrote some good books, but he destroyed our family. And 30 years later, right before Adorno dies, in the mid-60s, he writes this. He writes in response to his initial question after the Second World War, is art possible after Auschwitz? Or why make art after Auschwitz? And Adorno's answer, in terms of answering to him, was, you have to make art after Auschwitz. It's a responsibility. But I would suggest to you that it's important that art's justification in the context of suffering, injustice, is something that is a deep subject, or a deep concern of all writing, whether the critic is conscious of it or not. And the other thing I want to emphasize is that often art criticism is functions in order to resist the pressures of the market. Just because the market is telling you that this artist or this work of art is valuable does not simply mean that the art critic follows suit, and that the values of the market are different than the values of art criticism. And that art criticism, in many ways, can be the critique of the market that wants to turn all works of art into to commodities, to fetishize them, imbue them with a particular kind of aura that moves away, that obscures, blinds us to to a deeper content. And the art critic's role, perhaps, is to penetrate through that shine of the market. And certainly there were the auctions in New York this past week, with David Hockney doing well. I think one of his paintings was fetched $40 or $50 million, which is a record for a living artist. All this amidst the context of our country that is in California, that is burning and ruining lives and family and destroying people's livelihoods, amidst just a volatile and incredibly dangerous time politically. And then we have these auctions in New York where the uber rich spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on works of art of which they see as commodities, just something to be bought and sold. So I hope these thoughts are helpful to you. Have a great Thanksgiving, and you will be getting plenty of emails from me in your inbox over the next week or so. And write me if you have any questions. Have a great break.